Okay, hi everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you from wherever you are. It's lovely to have you joining us for this first co-sponsored session between the Marine Social Science Network, the Marine Science Coordinating Committee's Social Science Task Group, that is a mouthful, and the SMMR programme, so the UK Sustainable Management of UK Marine Resources programme as well. It's great for this to be a collaborative session, and we are the first of a series of topics relating to equality, diversity and inclusivity. And this first session is going to focus on race and ethnicity, and we've got two brilliant speakers. A couple of key things to just kind of bear in mind as we go through the session. It is being recorded, so it will be available after the session's finished. It'll be posted on the MarSocSci website and also on the SMMR website, and we'll share that link broadly. So please feel free to share it to anybody you think might be interested. As I said, it's the first in a series of sessions. So the next one is next week, next Thursday, where we'll be talking about access and disability, and there'll be future sessions in the new year. And I guess just to kind of highlight that this is the start of a conversation. It's an opportunity for us to ensure that as we start new projects, as is happening with the SMMR programme here in the UK, and kind of apply for new funding and really think about how we can create an inclusive and accessible community of research and practice for the ocean as we look at the ocean decade and beyond. This is the first opportunity for us to start that conversation and make sure that these topics relating to equality, diversity, inclusivity are at the forefront of our minds. So we're not trying to be exhaustive. We won't be able to cover everything in each hour-long session, but we hope that we are at least stimulating conversation and getting people to think differently about how we can be a more inclusive and accessible and open community. Please be respectful in the chat with your points and your comments to our speakers and to each other. If I see anything that is not respectful, then I may decide to remove people. I'm sure I won't have to do that, but please ensure that you are respectful to each other. And please put questions for our speakers in the Q&A box. And without further ado, I would like to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Anjana Katwa, who is going to speak to us on her experiences of working in the geosciences and her experience as a woman of colour, but also her vast experience of these issues around race and ethnicity and identity. So Anjana, I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emma. I'm going to share my screen because I've got a short talk that I'd like to share with everybody. A lot of the work that I do is concerning EDI and the natural heritage and cultural heritage spaces. I currently work as the engagement lead at Wessex Museums, where my job is really to look at how we bring historically excluded audiences into museum spaces. So really what I'm examining today is the absence of faces in our blue spaces, these black and brown faces, faces like mine. Where are they when we go to our coastal environments? I want to kick off by really examining quite a meaty case study. I live in Dorset. I've lived in Dorset for 17 years, and I was living in Dorchester, and now I live in East Dorset, about kind of 20 minutes drive from the coast. But for about 15 years, I worked for the Jurassic Coast World Heritage Site, managing and developing the education program, strategic education program. And so I've seen and worked with so many different communities across 100 miles of coastline. Now, one community that really strikes me in terms of its deprivation is Weymouth and Portland. What I'm showing you here on this slide is a map that is showing the multiple indices of deprivation in this coastal area, this coastal community. I want you to take away several things from this map. Firstly, take a look at the marine reserves we have around these areas. So we've got the Chesil Beach and what is that? The Stenth Ledges Marine Conservation Zone. We've got the South Portland Marine Conservation Zone just off the south of Portland. And then as we go further along the Jurassic Coast, we've got the Studland to Portland Special Area of Conservation, that SAC. Now, it's a beautiful place. I probably don't need to show you endless photographs of this beautiful Jurassic Coast. What I do want to show you is what life is like for those people living in those dark blue areas. So Weymouth and Portland is this district here. I'm sure you can see my arrow, hopefully you can't, but we're looking and examining what is life like for people living in these dark blue areas here. Now, Weymouth and Portland in 2019 was actually described as one of the most well, it actually falls into the 10% of the most deprived areas in the UK. And within Dorset overall, if we take out the conurbation of Bournemouth and Poole, which also has very high levels of deprivation, particularly in the Boscombe and the Poole area, Weymouth and Portland really stands out. It is the area in Dorset that has the highest levels of employment deprivation. There is a very high level of child poverty. The living environment is challenging. When we talk about access to high quality green spaces, it's limited for these families. When you talk about the quality of their housing, it's extremely poor. Communities here are living in real poverty, I would say, and it's really, really tough. And when we look at the impact of COVID on these communities, it's been a really, really hard 18 months, 2 years for them. And I was vice chair of the Dorset Race Equality Council, and we commissioned a survey, a questionnaire analysis of families living across Dorset, particularly Black and Asian families living across Dorset during COVID. And when we heard the stories coming out from families, particularly Black and Asian and migrant families living in Weymouth and Portland, it was really horrific. You know, there were families that were living in very cramped accommodation, no access to green spaces, green or blue spaces, despite living in Weymouth and Portland. And, you know, they're living in a culture and an environment where they're completely divorced from nature. So I just want you to keep this in mind, that these communities, you know, live in this incredibly beautiful place. It's such a beautiful place. It's a World Heritage Site. You've seen the pictures. I probably don't need to show them to you, but within that kind of landscape of beauty is this really kind of high level of poverty and deprivation that people experience every day. How do you live that experience and then look outside your window at this beautiful kind of Weymouth Bay with the Jurassic Coast? That's kind of what I want you to keep in mind. And then this happened in 2012. This is the London 2012 Olympic Games, and I've taken a picture off the London, you know, one of the Olympic websites. And these are some kind of sailors, and you can see Durdledore there with the beaches in the background, Bat's Head in the background. Now, when the Olympic Games came to Weymouth and Portland, I was part of the Jurassic Coast team, and it was my job to really examine how we kind of really brought the Olympics home for a lot of children and young people that were living in Dorset and East Devon. And what we did was, I developed a program which was designed to train teachers in schools across the whole county to build the Jurassic Coast and the Olympics into their schools and then into their communities. And I visited lots and lots of schools. I'd worked with them previously, but there was one school I went to in particular that really stood out for me. It was a Bingham Valley school, which was just outside Weymouth. And I went there and I did a kind of a training workshop with the teachers. And then I went back again to kind of really meet with the children. And what struck me was when I spoke to them about the Jurassic Coast, and I said, have you been fossil collecting? You know, what do you think, you know, what do you feel when you go to the beach? And there were some children there that said, actually, do you know what? I haven't been to the beach. They live in Bingham Valley, which is probably, if I was to drive in a car, probably about 10 minutes drive from Weymouth Beach. And there were children telling me that they hadn't been to the beach for a long time. And these children were living on an estate just outside the Bingham Valley School. Some of them were living in lone parent households. Some of them had multiple siblings. So you have to put yourself in that situation, as I did, of understanding what that child is trying to tell you, that actually their situation is really challenging. Their parent or their carer can't take them in a car because they don't have a car. It's very expensive to go on a bus into Weymouth Town Centre. So to go to the beach is not easy. It's difficult. There are financial barriers. There are other barriers, you know, in terms of, would they feel welcome there? You know, would they be able to do, you know, would they be able to go in the water? They may not be able to afford a bucket and spade. So, you know, there are all sorts of barriers there that prevent people from engaging with our natural green and blue spaces, where sometimes, particularly privileged people like myself, we may not even think about that. So that's what I want you to keep in mind. So the London 2012 Games was supposed to change all of this. It was supposed to bring a huge amount of opportunity in. It was supposed to regenerate this area. And it was supposed to connect people and communities with those blue spaces. But when we look at who uses the blue spaces, this is what I want to question. So I have, I'm talking about children and families living in the Weymouth and Portland area, growing up, from a young age, looking out across Weymouth Bay, is that space theirs? Does it belong to them? How do they access it? And these are the questions that I want you to keep in your mind, because when I looked at a report from the Sutton Trust, this is a report called Elitist Britain 2019, I thought to myself, right, okay, the Olympics came to Weymouth and Portland, and we know that there's huge deprivation there. But who are the people actually privileged enough to go out on a boat and sail in those waters? And when you look at the statistics of who those people are that can access those spaces, maybe you won't be shocked, but I think you'll be upset, because when we look at the Olympic medalists, 31% of sports people, that make it to go to the Olympics attended an independent school. What does that tell us? That tells us about social mobility. If you have the ability to go to a school that has the facilities, that has the confidence to tell you you will be brilliant, you will achieve, and you have a family behind you that will give you those opportunities, of course you're going to make it to this immense competition which tests the best in the world. So I just wanted to put that figure there from the Sutton Trust, that the majority of people that go to the Olympics, 31% of them attended an independent school. So when we put this into who uses blue spaces, let's look at the power of privilege of those particular athletes. And I'm focusing on Ben Ainslie, and I'm not taking anything away from Ben Ainslie, fantastic athlete, amazing and extraordinary Olympic gold medalist. But what I want to do is I want to unpack what that journey for Ben was like to get to that gold Olympic medal. He attended 2 independent schools, and actually his sister is married to what would have been, I think, the chief executive of the International Sailing Federation. So already there is an immense amount of privilege there. But what really struck me this morning is when I began to kind of explore Ben and his family, and how did he get to become this Olympic gold medalist sailor? I want to read you, just in case you can't see this slide, I want to read this statement from his father. And I want you to pick up on the immense amount of privilege that I saw in this statement, as talking from my position as a woman of colour. His father says, even at the age of 3 or 4, it was obvious that Ben enjoyed being on the water. My wife and I had a small boat, nothing fancy, and we used to take Ben and his sister Fleur out with us. I guess some people are frightened of water, but Ben wasn't. He was fascinated by it. Loved being out there. We got him an Optimist dinghy when he was about 8. People always think sailing's a rich man's sport, but I think that boat cost us about 100 quid. Joined the local sailing club in Cornwall, and we let him get on with it. He was obviously keen, so the next year we bought him a slightly better boat. So why do you think that would trigger somebody like me? If I told you that my mum and dad, my mum worked in a laundry, my father was a sign writer, so he had a craft apprenticeship. But I grew up in Slough. I grew up in a house with 8 other people. I probably didn't see the sea. I maybe saw the sea once every year, once every 2 years. There was no way that my family could ever have afforded to spend £100 on a boat. If I had wanted to do sailing, if I'd have seen it on the TV and thought, gosh, I really want to do that, mum and dad, can you please buy me it? There would have been no question. And to even think that my family could afford a boat, get it to some coastal locality, and then for me to even join a sailing club, you can see how this would automatically leave me on the other side of the fence, looking on at this experience that I could never ever relate to. And I mean, when we talk about colour, where do I belong? Do I belong in a sailing club? Have I seen people like myself in the sailing fraternity? And I don't. And I've just taken this picture of Team GB that went to Tokyo 2020. Look at the faces. There are no black and brown faces there. And I wonder why. And when we look at some of the profiles and the biographies behind these faces, let's look at who they are. I've taken 2 examples here. This is Charlotte Dobson and Saskia Tidy. I apologize for the spelling there. Both of them went to independent schools. But what's really interesting about this is I've taken this off the Lowman School, which is a fee-paying school. Look at the fees. but also look at the statement. This is something that Charlotte Dobson did during lockdown. She went to the school and she did an Instagram takeover for the school. And I'm sure she's a brilliant, inspiring Olympian. I mean, I'm inspired reading her story and what she's achieved, but I wasn't part of that audience. And my community, the South Asian and Black community living in urban centers or in deprived areas, weren't part of that community who were connecting with her. And what I want to ask you is, who is being inspired by her doing that Instagram takeover? It is the pupils of the Lowman School, where the annual fees for the senior school are over £13,000. And when you look at her biography, she started sailing at the age of 3. So the access to blue spaces is often to do with opportunity, family connections, wealth, and privilege. And that is where it started to feel really uncomfortable for me when I began to examine what are the stories behind these faces. And when we look at Black and Asian engagement with blue and green spaces, this is my experience. So Saskia, she learned to sail when she was 3 years old. I'm really happy for her. I'm sure she had brilliant experiences. My experiences, that one trip a year to the Isle of Wight was filled with racism. It was filled with a sense of questioning about whether I belonged, and I was made to feel like I was not welcome. Did Saskia or a Charlotte experience this when they were sailing, when they were 3 years old? I don't think so. And what is it about us? People assume, and these are some tweets, and I've only got a minute or so left, but these are some tweets questioning whether Black and Asian people belong in nature. You know, there's an assumption that because you don't see us, we're not interested. And it's utterly ridiculous, you know, because my parents growing up in Nairobi would go out into natural spaces in Nairobi and the surrounding kind of, you know, areas of nature outside the city. It's not that we don't love nature, we love nature. It's just that there are barriers for us to engage with nature. And I'm going to show you this incredible picture. 1918, Indian soldiers on the shores of the Dead Sea skimming stones. So when you see tweets like that accusing people like myself, my community, of not loving nature, of not interested, how does this picture make you feel? Taken, you know, over 100 years ago, of brown people skimming stones on the Dead Sea. I think it's really powerful. And why don't we feel welcome? It's all embedded in racism. And this is a statement from the landowner of the Lulworth Heritage Estate, who called us the culturally diverse, blaming us for vandalism and litter on the beaches last summer. And nothing was done to challenge this. It was down to me to compile a bunch of people together, including the Ramblers, to challenge this letter in the Times that was published. So it makes us angry when we do go out to nature. We're blamed for no reason whatsoever about how nature is treated. And, you know, where is the problem? The problem lies systemically within our organizations. Look at these statistics. 0.6% of the workforce in the environment sector are Black and Asian. And I existed in that space for over 15 years. And I tell you, it is very, very hard to survive and be in that space and push for equity and diversity when you are such a small voice that's not being listened to by those higher up at the board level. So there are huge barriers to engagement for us, ranging from racism all the way through to programs that are created that don't reflect our interests. And when you look at who's moving into those spaces, we're not even in the university degrees that would qualify us to move into jobs that would allow us to work in those spaces. So when you look at a physical geography degree, 7.5% of people moving into those degrees are Black and Asian. So are you surprised when you look at the 0.6% figure for environmental employment, Black and Asian faces in the environment sector? I'm not surprised. If we're not attracting those families into nature in the first place, if we can't get those young people into degrees because they don't have that connection with nature, are we then surprised that our sector is so monocultural and that programs are designed, you know, in absence of our experiences? So obviously, I want to end it on a positive note. There are huge ways that we can begin to challenge this, and maybe I can talk about this in the chat, but it is all about this impactful training that you guys need to go through to embed EDI into your processes. But the key thing is creating that systemic change within organizations, so you're listening to the communities that you want to come and enter into those blue spaces. Thank you so much.
Anjana, thank you so much for such a thought-provoking and, as you quite rightly warned me, uncomfortable presentation. And I think it should make many of us on the call uncomfortable and make us question and think about the practices and processes that are in place and that we've been privileged by. And I think it's really important for us to have had your insight and those thoughts that you've had. I'm sure people will have lots of questions and comments for Anjana, so I encourage you to put those in the Q&A. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to our second speaker, and then we'll welcome both Anjana and Zandi to the panel to have that conversation together. So thank you again, Anjana, and Zandile Novu. Sorry, Zandi, I got your name wrong there. Sorry. I got it right so well. Thank you so much. So Zandi is joining us from Mombasa. It is very, very warm.
Very warm.
Very, very warm. And Zandi's going to be talking to us from a different perspective. Zandi is the founder of a charity, the Black Mermaid Foundation. So Zandi, I'm going to hand over to you. I know you're not sharing slides, so I will still switch my camera off. But over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. I don't know if you can hear me. I hope everyone can hear me properly. So my name is Zandile Ndlovu, and I'm the founder of an organization called the Black Mermaid Foundation. So how my work started was that I became a freediving instructor, and when I became a freediving instructor, I also found out that I was South Africa's first Black female freediving instructor. And it ended up being a really, really big thing in my country because many people did not understand what it is, but also many people could not understand how a girl from Soweto, a landlocked city in Johannesburg, ended up living in the ocean in the way in which I do today. And so, Dr. Anjana touched on every single part that matters when we speak about representation, when we speak about access and all the good. So either I'm gonna have to put on my fan or we might just die of heat. And so why did I found the Black Mermaid Foundation? I had been on many boats, and on many boats, I was always the only Black person. And being the only Black person on boats as a guest can become violent. So in spaces that are undiverse, it is so normal for violence to be the norm. In South Africa, our history comes from, we have a bad racial history. We come from apartheid. And so to be on those boats, I would be asked many questions, be it if it's about my hair, or I thought Black people don't swim, and how did you, my body, right? My body always remained a big part that would also be isolated when we're looking for wetsuits and an ant. And so it's a continuous existence of questioning your competency, questioning why you're there, and also just asking you to assimilate in order for you to exist in those spaces. And so typically my hair would always be an issue. And people will always say, no, but we don't mean it in that way, but no one else's hair would be discussed. And then simple things like language. In South Africa, a lot of people speak Afrikaans, and I would go on courses and people would speak in Afrikaans. And when I would ask for clarification, and I mean, for us, a small percentage of South Africa speaks Afrikaans. And so when I would ask for clarification, someone would say, don't worry, I'll explain to you later. And again, just an othering of your existence, even though you didn't pay less to be there. And so these spaces can be violent. And so I decided I wanted to create diverse representation in the ocean spaces. Why? Because South Africa is 70% Black. So where were the Black people? But part two, I needed to create a safe space for people to be able to exist in these oceans, for Black people to be able to exist in these oceans without needing to explain the whole time. And so diversity, equality, inclusion. Why does diversity matter? For me, it matters because we then get to tap into the genius that humanity is, leading us into the question of representation. So diversity, who's in the room? Are we all in the room? But then furthering it on, outside of the genius says representation. Who is showing up? Who is speaking to us? Are they able to see where we come from? And so for me, who's in the room? Who allows us to engage in the deepest ways, and we get to look at the different societal ailments that ensure that everyone And most importantly, the most vulnerable communities are seen and heard, and are also stewards for the work that we do. So representation is everything. It is race, it is gender, it is bodies, it is physical abilities. I spoke recently and the kids kept on pointing out the fact that I had hips. And so you realize that these things matter. What we put out into the world for the young people, for the youth, it matters. And so I didn't realize how my body also mattered until I battled to fit into wetsuits, and how the world had not seen enough of these bodies, my body, in a wetsuit. So I'm gonna ask to wipe my face. Let me tell you, it is crazy humid here. And so there was a continuous discomfort of being held up. And later in the Bahamas, I had an opportunity to speak with kids that were in the Bahamas. And Bahamas is, they don't identify with race. But what was incredible is that all the kids that reached out to me after the fact all said, she looks like me, right? And so we were a range of speakers and all of the talks were important. But what remained was the fact that those kids said, she dives and she looks like me. And so that for me was the most incredible thing. And then I was asked to come back again and talk to them, because all of a sudden when I say the ocean belongs to you, I didn't grow up around the ocean, but also the ocean can be a safe space for you to find yourself and to pause everything else that you thought you knew so that you can breathe, a place where your body is safe. And that's what the ocean is for me. It's the one place where I can go, and I don't need to be afraid. I can be true, and I'm not afraid of what will come. And I think, you know, like Dr. Anjana said, that many people don't have to live with that continuous fear, that waiting for someone to just come for your peace and other your existence in a collective space. And so inclusion says, those who are in the room are seen and heard. Looking at South Africa, our history again with its racial challenges, it challenges the fact of the currencies and the currencies that are in the room and the currency of voice. It questions what efforts are being made to not only see who is speaking and who is in the room, but also amplify the voices that are traditionally not seen and have previously been oppressed and marginalized. What does it mean to become allies, to understand that a system that lived for so long needs to meet the same intentionality to break it? And in my experience, equality says equal access. And I'm gonna go in for that towel again, because oh my God. So whoever's gonna rewatch this, just remember that South Africa's not often this hot and I'm still trying to figure out this heat. Equality says equal access to these oceans. Currently, the ocean is unequal at the baseline level. So when we're talking shore play, when I was little, I think it was my first time at the sea, I must have been about 12 years old, and was splashing in the shallows. When the water was at your ankle, you were doing great. When the water was at your knees, you'd be pulled out the water, because how dare you try and kill yourself between those white waters? And so the idea of exploration in the ocean was something that was never accessible to us, because at the baseline, no one knew how to swim. And so if anything went wrong, no one would be able to save you. And so when we're looking at resources required to access these oceans, the question is, you know, are we in swimming competent communities where if anything goes wrong, someone else from the community can run in and save someone? But also it's the time that's required of these guardians. You know, Dr. Anjana spoke so beautifully about how this Olympic team, the resources required to make them the best in the world was the change agent of how they became these best in the world. And so it's the time required of guardians, which are both scarce resources in previously oppressed and marginalized communities that are now also the most vulnerable. And so the ocean will always become an other thing that is disassociated from the local communities. And it always belongs to them, right? And everywhere I go, everyone always says, why do you do white people things? And I say, I don't do white people things. It's a question of environment, and that's also important too. And so for us, when people say them, it often references white people. And it's often the most privileged people who are tourists in these communities. And in the deeper seas, maybe you know how to swim, but the gear that is required in order to be able to access this ocean, or the costs that are required to become a diver, and you dive once at least every 3 months so that you're able to keep your certification in place. We need to be continuously looking at that. And so this is also a challenge. So let's say you get the certification, we need to bridge the gap to ensure that the community continues to dive even after they've been provided a level of access to dive. So intentionality by making it accessible and building in income streams around it for vulnerable communities to be able to participate here too, because the ocean space is often premised in privilege. Ocean conservation has generally postured itself, I find it very elitist, and it often sifts out the population as to who can access this conservation space. And for me, I found that it's done in 3 ways, and I'm about to go into my towel again. So I find that ocean conservation does this in 3 ways. It arrives in local communities with a helicopter approach. It arrives, it tells the people what to do, how to be, how to change in their waters without actively engaging these communities. And these communities are typically Black and brown communities, right? And so they make little efforts then to rise up the community in a way that allows people from the community to be at interfacing level with the community, being experts as and being peers in the work that is being done. And so it leads for conservation to then look white, where Black and brown kids continue to look at the saviorism ideal around who has come to save their oceans for them. And so what does it mean to make this ocean belong more to them too? Where they are saving their oceans for themselves too. Representation allows people to see themselves in those shoes as conservationists, as marine biologists, as skippers, as all the teams that are often required and that show up in these diving arenas and in these communities to work on, these oceans that are being saved. So it changes the narrative. Otherwise, it's another organization that has just come and be in the savior of saviorism, and what does it mean to capacitate the communities that we work with. The second thing for me is that I particularly battle with in conservation is how conservation will often place water and animals before people, which I find it very difficult. As a conservationist, I believe in people first. I believe that it is people that hold government to account. I believe that it is people that protect these oceans. I believe that when we're looking at behavioral change, both in local ocean-facing communities and in landlocked cities, it is people that bring the change. And I feel like we need to be investing in this narrative too, because as we save our oceans, we need to find ways to ensure that the local ocean-facing communities are being saved as well. And they also have access to these oceans in order to be able to make a living. And that for me has always been difficult in that space. And last is the expectation that these organizations can only be run by white people, where privilege is a prerequisite in order to be able to access money and access resources to make these projects work. So all these communities might be part of conservation works, but they never fully take over their own saving of their own oceans, because ultimately someone will always say, well, I'm the connection to the funding. And so what does it mean for us to look at all levels of conservation to say who is supporting, how are they supporting, how are we capacitating Black and brown communities to also be stewards and leaders and stakeholders of their own oceans too. And just more collaboration work. Oh my God, we're gonna die. So I hope this this rain work is not gonna kill us, but I'm almost done. Most recently in my work in the Seychelles, a community that is also non-racial was realizing that the conversation around blue ocean economies would require the youth to be deeply engaged, but also to see how women can have greater access to these oceans when we speak blue ocean economy. You know, who are the fishermen? Who is heading out on these big vessels? Who is accessing the tourism space? How does it look in order for everyone to be able to access it? And so here is the small island developing state that is leading the world in protection of their oceans. And so as the exclusive economic zone grows, they're leading the discussion on ocean protection and conservation, and are seeking solutions that make these oceans more accessible in business too for their communities. And so I want to bring us to these 3 points: that access is relative and proximity does not equate to access, as Dr. Anjana said. And last, the how is as important as the end. And so even with our ocean communities, however it is that we seek to save our oceans, the how so deeply matters. And just a quick snapshot into South Africa, now that we're looking to save 30% of our oceans by 2030, we have had a challenge where certain lands were taken in not right ways, premised as marine protection spaces, and that was not the case. And so now people have to go back and apologize for the distrust and the cheating that has happened in order to be able to create space for the oceans. And so are we allowing the relevant healing that is attached to the conservation of these oceans where people's lands were taken away, right? And I think that's also an important part of the discussion when we speak about conservation and these lands that we're protecting. And so diversity, equality, and inclusion, but most importantly, culture and historical narratives. These are crucial parts of this discussion. And so story matters, representation matters, access matters, but also who do we give the humanity that the world often takes away from Black and brown bodies? So those who have always been outside, how do we actively and intentionally get them back in? How do we build a strategy around a system that was designed to keep this group out and this group in, while making the possibilities accessible for all? How does privilege influence the work we do and taint the lens of our perceived? Because science is not only the only measure, but it's the social aspect too. How do we bridge the gap of inequality? And who are the stakeholders? How do we make these oceans accessible in ways that allow these ocean-facing communities to have the sense of ownership and authority around their oceans too? Of course, landlocked communities as well, to understand that everything is all connected. It starts with experiencing it and creating the connection needed in order for people to feel at home enough to protect it. On a recent trip, on a recent trip from Nairobi to Mombasa, a discussion was happening on the train with the guy that was sitting next to me. It ended in the question that said to me, he said, who are we saving these seas for? You want us to save our seas? Sure, for who? I said, I hear you. And of course, the discussion said, we have no tangible connection to the sea aside from the fear that we hold. Our beaches are filled with tourists where we're told that this part is reserved, that part is reserved, that part is reserved. And if you're gonna swim, you need to go swim over there. The furthest places when we look at places like Diani Beach. And so you have to walk forever in order to be able to access these oceans that we are supposed to save. And so who are you asking us to save these oceans for? Because they clearly have enough money to save them for themselves. We have bigger problems. And so what is bigger problems? It is survival, today's survival. Africa is not only $1 a day, we are more than this, but we are still building and are capacitating communities to be able to see past the today, where the currency of living is no longer day to day, but enough to see forward, enough to 2030 to 2050. Because at the moment, these numbers are over there with them and not us. We're saving these oceans for 2030. People are trying to survive right now. So my work in the Black Mermaid Foundation is future focused. It recognizes that though Africa's is different when we talk bread and butter issues, it's always the question of survival. It is also our greatest currency upon which change will come by numbers alone, Africa as a continent. And so we focus on the youth for this reason. They are the future presidents, future policymakers, future business leaders, and regular citizens that we're going to be able to call upon when we need action, when we need for these oceans to be protected. They are going to be the guardians that stand up. Because these oceans would not only belong to them, but they would belong to the youth too. They would belong to their people too, in ways that matter most. We have work to do in bridging the gap, capacitating, healing, and we can only do it together. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandy, and I hope you don't melt. Oh my goodness, you did so well to keep focused in that heat. I'm very impressed. So many of us are sitting in December, freezing weather, so we can very much not empathize, but I was feeling you. You did very well.
Probably no one can believe how hot it is here.
I think we're just all jealous because we're freezing.
Exactly. Thank you, Sandy, for such a fantastic and passionate speech and talk on your own experiences and how you have facilitated conversations and facilitated access. There was so much that I just took from both the talks, but I really thought some things that really kind of touched me was that the ocean is unequal at the baseline level. Like for me, that felt like such an emotional statement to make and to really think about, and really got me thinking. And I love science is not the only thing we need to think about. We need to think about social. That is very important for the Marine Social Science Network. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop talking because I feel like I could talk to you both for ages. There have been lots of comments in the chats and there are a couple of questions. So the first question from Fionn Mitchell has said, are there any organizations in our sector that are embodying what you would consider to be best practice? Or can you give some examples of what best practice looks like to you? And Jana, you said about, I think one of your slides had some points. So perhaps I'll come to you on that first and then I'll go to Sandy.
I think there, obviously I've moved from the natural heritage sector over to museums, and I would say you need to look towards the museum sector to understand and analyze what they are doing in order to engage underserved audiences. I mean, number one is really looking at your governance structure within your organizations. Who's sitting at the top tables? Who's on your boards? How is that decision-making process and those attitudes influencing programming, decisions, policies, frameworks? I think that it has to start there. It has to start internally with the change within the organization. Then secondly, you need to be moving yourself into a space where you're listening to your communities. So you're not waiting for them to come to you. So you're announcing an opportunity and then wondering why people aren't applying for funding or people aren't engaging with a certain aspect of your programming. You need to go out to them to co-create and co-curate projects. And also you need to build those links and relationships so when you are applying for the funding, they are equitable as your partners. And I think I sit on the EDI National Task Force for National Lottery Heritage Fund. This is the recommendations that are going in as we move forward into future funding programs. Organizations like Lottery will want to see your organization working equitably with community organizations, so they are equally balanced in terms of what is achieved and what will be achieved for those end users. Does that make sense? So I'm going to hand over to Zendia. I don't want to take up
Absolutely. No, thank you. I was just going to kind of reflect actually really quickly on that point. And I think we said about kind of going to where people are. For me, that sounds like a really crucial thing, that it's not just enough to go, look, there's this opportunity, because if people haven't seen themselves represented, they're perhaps going to think that that opportunity isn't for them. And so going to where people are and having that conversation and really kind of facilitating that dialogue, of course, it just feels quite passive to just go, here's this opportunity. So taking a much more active approach. So thank you. That was really, really valuable. Dan, did you have any thoughts on that point?
I think Dr. Anjana, knocked it out the park, because essentially all that it is you need to get the community involved. You need to meet the community where they are. You need to participate, read, and ensure that we are collaborating, less helicoptering in.
Yeah.
And so it is to recognize that this knowledge is incredible knowledge as well, and the Western way is not the only way. And so what does it mean to amplify the people's knowledge in a way that allows them to participate meaningfully? So you look at South Africa, in the medical industry, traditional healers have been brought up to the space of doctors as well, because the idea of medicine looking one way is again premised on the oppressive. And so what does it mean for us to unpack our knowns in order to question the departure point of all of the things that we do? Is it premised in privilege? And if it's premised in privilege, what does it mean to for the people that sit around the table to know that the table is not only diverse, but it is inclusive enough for the currency of the voices that speak to be equal enough to matter and create the change that we want to see.
Thank you. And Anjana, you mentioned the Heritage Lottery Fund project. Are there any other organizations that you think have good practices that perhaps, I mean, maybe it's a case of sharing in the chat, but I think people would really, particularly as those of us that are starting to develop new projects, and that we really want to look to where we can do things and make sure that we are integrating these into our project designs and action. So any suggestions?
I can definitely suggest you follow Backbone CIC, and they are a CIC based up in Scotland, and they are trying to, they in fact, they are in the very, they've had some good news, and they will be developing a Black, Asian and minority ethnic academy for leaders in the outdoor sector. So this is open to any organizations that want to enhance diversity within their ranks of folks that are leading on, for example, sailing. Backbone CIC, and I'll put the link in the chat, are leading on a program, and they've had some good news lately, so that is going to be going ahead. And it's also just worth, if you have, you know, the opportunity to have consultancy money, is just to talk to organizational leaders like that, to learn from them. And I think certainly when I talked about the museum sector, it's the decolonization of the natural space. So my recommendation is to look at Corinne Fowler, who is at the University of Leicester and has worked with the National Trust to look at the decolonization of their properties. It's just putting yourself into a space where you are learning about how that process can happen and how you then apply it back to your own setting.
That's great, thank you. And I've seen also that people are sharing different links in the chat, and what I'll do is I'll save that and try and put them all under the recording from this session so that you can all access those. I'll try to remember to do that. Sandy, are there any examples, of course, other than your own work, the Black Mermaid Foundation, are there any examples that you would like to mention that have kind of been best practice?
I think I would say, so I love what iMwater is doing. They're based here in South Africa, and they have started making sure that their coaches also come from the communities in which they work, so that the kids are able to see themselves represented. But I think they've also introduced a way in which the coaches are being paid, right? Whereas conservation often premises itself in volunteer your time and find yourself to the place, and people in vulnerable communities don't have that. And I think that's probably one of the things that I celebrate about them currently. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I've heard a few talks from young people recently, actually, where that issue of funding for time and compensation for time is you know, really important. So thank you for raising that as well. And actually that brings us on to a second question that's in the chat, which came up, I think, in response to both of your talks, really, around, I think you both mentioned around representation and helping young people, that next generation of ocean environmental conservationists, managers, researchers, seeing that the ocean belongs to all of us and belongs to them, and they are part of that ocean system. And there's a question on how we break the cycle, particularly focusing on kind of young people. How do we break that cycle and kind of work to ensure that we are providing that representation and supporting work to break those barriers and enhancing representation for communities? And Jan, I'm going to come to you first, and then I'll go to Xander.
Thanks. It's all about representation and embedding that connection with blue and green spaces in those communities who are so divorced. So just by way of example of projects that you could begin to design is we, so this is myself as a technical advisor on the project, co-PI, with two earth science professors from Open University. We have secured NERC EDI funding to train people of colour who are leading walking groups in 4 parts of the UK about the natural history and the landscape evolution of the areas they take their groups over. Okay, so why are we training the mothers and the fathers and the grandparents of the folks going on these walks? Because our argument is that it starts within the family. So if we can use our parents and our carers and our grandparents as the influencers we will begin to draw in young people, and particularly children who naturally in those communities are quite divorced from nature. We want to create a system of influence within that family unit, starting with the parents and the carers, so that they're able to engender a love for and an understanding of nature within their unit. So this is a NERC EDI funded program. It runs for 6 months, and we are going to be evaluating really carefully how our embedding of understanding of the science of the landscapes enhances enjoyment of nature, which then leads on to seeing the nature and the conservation area as a field where children can be encouraged to enter in terms of careers. So I think it all starts with working, like I said, working in equity with the communities, but providing opportunities to enable and empower, rather than gatekeeping the power of knowledge and expertise over here. It's about bringing that knowledge and expertise over to the community and handing it over. I think this is where kind of project work needs to shift towards.
Amazing, thank you. And I guess that really also responds to the comments both of you have made around helicopter science and parachute science, and it's about capacity building. So if you do go, you do that training, you provide a legacy that you don't, as you say, kind of hold on to that ownership and of knowledge, and I think you both mentioned around the fact that Western focus on knowledge and academic science is perhaps not the only knowledge type or value type that we need to be showcasing and highlighting and promoting when we're thinking about how we work towards ocean conservation. So thank you very much for that. Sandy, do you have any thoughts on that around increasing engagement of young people?
So yes, what I've loved recently, what's been beautiful about, I think I've always taken for granted popular culture, right? So when you look at hip hop tells us what is cool. And so what does it mean to redefine and change how the information is going out into the young communities so that it is easier to consume? So typically, even in film today, when I watch ocean conservation films, I'm always irritated because the question is, who are you speaking to? And everyone's always speaking to the same WhatsApp group. No one's speaking to the communities that don't belong to these oceans, right? And even with my friends, I always say, I don't want to hang out with you guys because there's this exclusivity that kind of happens around these ocean people. So break that exclusivity, break the barriers that make it inaccessible, where, what does it mean to bring people with you? And as humans, we love exclusive spaces and we need to break that, right? 1. 2, when I speak about popular culture, it's been in Kenya, right? All the taxis have Biggie on them, and they've got like all of these people of my time that were really cool. And it tells you that there's something there. So again, we need to change how we are putting out the information so that it's easier to consume, and find a way to popularize it in a way that green and blue spaces are cool spaces. And what I learned most recently in the Seychelles was how there's this one school, and it's called, I think, Saint Bay Anne. But what they do with these schools is the kids from a young age learn about their green and blues, right? But then every single environment is a part of the learning thing, right? But they have trees there, they have fruits that they are growing, they keep animals on the school, and they've got a little fish pond. And these things were incredible for me because growing up in Soweto, everything is brown. You have no access, you don't know what, you've never seen a giraffe, the only thing you've seen is a rat, a cat, and a dog. And then one day you're so cool and you make it to some park, and everyone's like, oh, why don't you know that bird? And again, it's the way in which we hear people who don't come from the privilege that we do. We assume that our normative is the only normative. And so we continuously need to break our privilege that assumes what is known and what is not known. And so I think at school level, at community level, with our friends, continuously holding ourselves to account. What is my privilege that allows me to see the lens of life in a different way, where this is a stupid question because there's no such thing. It's just a question of access and privilege.
I think that's a really good point, Sandil, and I gave a talk about this last week. What lens are you looking at through in order to appreciate the natural landscape, whether that's green or whether that's blue? And, for a lot of Black and Asian communities, we don't learn how to swim. There are all sorts of cultural barriers for Black and Asian children, and particularly women, in terms of learning how to swim. So when you do go to coastal spaces and you're gazing out over that ocean or the sea, it is alien to you. You haven't got that experience. I have to say, I only learned to swim when I was about 18 or 19, I think. My mum cannot swim, and I don't know any women, any South Asian women in my community that have literally gone out there and learned how to swim. So I think there has to be an understanding within the sector about really the cultural aspects of what do the coastal spaces mean to us, and how do we want to, you know, experience that. And that's what we mean when we say go out to your communities and listen and talk to them, because if you talk to them, they'll actually say to you, actually, you saw it from my photo from 1986. We looked like we were going to the shopping mall, the way we were dressed. We wouldn't wear, you know, my grandmother wouldn't wear what, you know, white people would wear on the beach. So we just consume nature in a very different way. And as soon as you begin to understand that, that's when the effective working relationship comes into force.
And Jenna, thank you so much. I feel like that kind of really summarized the reason for these sessions was around recognizing and questioning our own internal social norms and the worldviews that each person has, and recognizing that they make those systems and those processes have made us only consider certain groups historically. And we really need to recognize, I love Zandelia, the point about going to young people with hip hop and rap, and recognize that people don't consume information in the same way. What works for one group won't work for another, and really recognizing that and highlighting that as part of our projects and the work we're doing to try and enhance our connection to the ocean. There's not one person on this call, on this meeting, who doesn't want to foster greater connection between people and the ocean. That's why we've all gotten into the careers that we're in, right? So how we do that is, like, I guess, breaking down those barriers and that creating that collaboration and co-creation and enhancing that representation and access. So I think that was a really fantastic kind of summary point, really, that really brought together lots of the points that you've both covered in the session. I know Anjana's unfortunately got to definitely leave us at once. You've got to go. Yeah. So I'll finish the session now anyway. Thank you all so much for such a passionate an important conversation. Thank you to those of you who joined us. As I said, the recordings will be made available, and I'll send these to all the speakers as well. We will have our next session next week. Zandy, thank you so much for managing in 30-degree heat and humidity. Even worse, it's the humidity that's the killer. Really, really grateful to have you both here as speakers. And for everybody joining, I hope you can join us next week, where we'll have Sheena Asthana, who will be talking to us about coastal community deprivation and access. And we'll also have representation from Wet Wheels, which is a disability charity. We'll talk about disability and access to coastal spaces as well. So look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you all again, and goodbye. Stay safe and well. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.